tror vi drar igång på en gång. And with that, I will switch to English, which will be the language of this seminar with the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency. My name is Katarina Tracz, and it is my pleasure and honor to be the moderator of this seminar themed Malign Information Influence in the US election that is organized by the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency, MPF. As many of you might know, in past US presidential elections, we have seen malign information influence attempts aimed at creating distrust in the election results. What are the main concerns ahead of this year's elections? What lessons have been learned from previous attempts to influence election results and sow distrust, and what measures are being taken in order to protect the 2024 US presidential elections? These are some of the questions that will be raised here today during this seminar. And in order to do this, I have a highly distinguished and highly knowledgeable set of panelists from near and abroad. First, starting from abroad, we have Michael Weiss, who is the English language editor of The Insider, co-author of the New York Times bestseller ISIS. We also have Jakub Kalenský, deputy director of the Hybrid Center of Influence in Helsinki, and Andrea Liebman, who is a senior analyst here at MPF. And we will soon listen to their insights, and in the last 10 or 15 minutes of this seminar, you, the audience, will have time to pose questions. So, with no further ado, I would like to start by welcoming Michael up on the stage. Michael, please.
Thank you all for coming. I thought I would start by giving a kind of tour de horizon of the most notorious foreign interference campaign in a US election, which was the 2016 election. I realize this is a mostly Swedish audience, and whereas in the United States we are absolutely exhausted and bored to death hearing about this, I think it's important to kind of relitigate some of the findings, both by the Mueller investigation and 5 different reports issued by the Senate Committee on Intelligence, which actually got into even more detail than Mueller. There are broad takeaways I'm sure everybody is very familiar with. The first being that there was an active campaign sponsored by the Russian government, but carried out by a putatively private internet research agency, also known as the St. Petersburg Troll Farm. This was the thing that was founded by the late Yevgeny Prigozhin, which sought to influence the election, namely by denigrating Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee, and supporting her rival Donald Trump. What was lesser known about the troll farm is that actually they got to work before the election in 2014 by dispatching 2 different operatives to the United States who conducted their own sociological and election canvassing research, essentially in all of the major swing states. Illinois, Michigan, etc. So they were able to return to St. Petersburg and actually inform their own organization about here are how Americans in these constituencies think, these are the pressure points, these are the social issues that most enervate them. What was also interesting about this social media-driven aspect of the campaign is it didn't really come up with or concoct new information streams or bits of disinformation and propaganda. What it did, rather adroitly, was seize upon things that were already in the American bloodstream, if you like, in our own ecosystem. Chiefly, these had to do with the Second Amendment rights, which is gun rights. Race and immigration were huge topics of conversation and debate. And to quote the Senate report, one of the goals was to, quote, pit Americans against one another and against their government, which I think the IRA did quite successfully. They were very, very skillful at seizing upon what was then a fairly marginal but growing movement called Black Lives Matter, which I will come to again. They also identified both pro-Muslim and anti-Muslim or anti-immigrant and anti-refugee strands and amplified both. So it was very promiscuous in terms of the kind of information schemes that they were pushing. But it's very interesting that the Senate found that no issue was more instrumentalized by the troll farm than that of race. 66% of content posted by Prigozhin's network contained a term related to race. This was on Facebook. 96% of its content on YouTube targeted racial issues and police brutality. Now, in a way, I'm not saying that the Russians had this level of prescience, but it showed that they were already looking at phenomena in America's socio-political landscape, which a few years later exploded onto a national and even international level. With respect to hack and leak operations, the two most notorious elements of this were two different units of Russia's military intelligence service, the GRU, units 26165 and 74455. Both of these units managed to hack into computer networks belonging to the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, and also the email account of John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign chief. They exfiltrated hundreds of thousands of communications, and they released them originally through their own cutout organizations or fronts, known as DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0. These were posing as, in one case, a Romanian cyber activist or hacker, and in another, something that was ostensibly homegrown, given the name DC Leaks. But when they really got into clover here is when they discovered a relationship, or rather solicited and were eagerly accepted into a relationship with WikiLeaks. Which, under the then active control of Julian Assange, made it very clear, both to the GRU and I think to the public at broad, that they were stumping for a Donald Trump victory. I mean, Assange was outspoken against Clinton. He saw her as one of his arch rivals, somebody who was looking to put him in prison, etc. And the timing of these things was quite apt. The Podesta emails, which, again, personal communication between Clinton's campaign chief and other members of the campaign, dropped within an hour of a bombshell Washington Post disclosure about Donald Trump's infamous comments about how he can grab women by the genitals. And this had the potential impact of swaying the election against him, because it was this kind of scandal that would normally sink an American politician. But instead, WikiLeaks and the GRU were able to change the nature of the conversation into internal communications about Democratic Party politics. And one of the issues, which I know from my own reporting, that the Democratic Party had in response was they could not certify that they had been hacked and that these emails were authentic, because they did not have the capability to pour through all of the communication to ensure that, for instance, the Russians were not planting fake emails or polluting or distorting the content. So there was a kind of inbuilt vulnerability on the part of those who might say we are the victims of a hostile foreign intelligence operation, in that they could not be as forthcoming about what they knew as possible. Now, here's an interesting fact about the election interference in 2016, which is, I think, under-publicized, or under-remembered, I should say. One way that Assange and WikiLeaks tried to obscure the provenance of their information was Assange had repeatedly insinuated that Seth Rich, who is a Democratic Party staffer who was murdered in what clearly, or well, not so clearly as I'm about to get into, but what at the time seemed like a robbery gone wrong in Washington, D.C., he implied that Seth Rich was one of his sources, wink wink, was the guy leaking internal Democratic communiques. This was a conspiracy theory that took off like nothing else. It led to the Rich family suing multiple parties who made this baseless allegation. But what was interesting about this is it has been reported, based on U.S. federal documents, that within 3 days of Seth Rich's murder in July of 2016, the U.S. intercepted an SVR intelligence brief suggesting that they would like to turn this Seth Rich murder into a conspiracy theory and say that it was the Democratic Party that killed him. So what we have here is a very interesting congruence of two different streams, or two different operations perpetrated by two different Russian special services. The GRU and its perhaps witting accomplice Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, using an SVR concocted conspiracy theory, which took off like wildfire among the far right in the United States, to elide the provenance of a GRU intelligence operation. This is a kind of a rare bit of cooperation between two services that are notoriously at odds with one another, Russian military and Russian civilian foreign intelligence. Other findings with respect to the election, which also went underreported at the time, was that even before the November vote, Russian hackers linked to state services had managed to penetrate the electoral infrastructure in all 50 states in the Union. Now, what they did was they didn't alter data, so far as we know. They certainly didn't change any votes, so far as we know, but they exfiltrated thousands and thousands and thousands of reams of voter registration data. And this is important. Why? Well, if you know your Cold War spy history, when you want to create a legend for an operative you're going to dispatch into the West, you need things like their birthday. If they had died and you're looking to kind of bring them back to life with fake documents, the date of their death, where they live, their full name, social security number is helpful. So the Russians here have managed to obtain data that could be used by the special services in future to dispatch illegals or foreign operatives into the United States. But they also did something even more, I think, profound, which is they called into question the very integrity of America's election system. So whilst they didn't change any votes or sway it, they didn't have to, because all of a sudden people started to worry, well, if the Russians can get into our computers that determine the outcome of democratic election, you know, how secure are we? And this vulnerability fed directly into what happened 4 years later in 2020. So this was an election where there isn't significant amounts of data suggesting the Russians did anything like they had done in 2016, but in a way they didn't have to, because the incumbent and now former President Donald Trump basically took it away from there. He lost the election in what was considered by his own Department of Homeland Security to be the safest and securest election ever held in American history. But it didn't stop him and his surrogates from spreading conspiracy theories that the election had been stolen by Joe Biden and his surrogates in the Democratic Party. They mounted this feverish campaign against Dominion voting systems, suggesting that they were in league with Antifa and the Venezuelan government to rig or change people's votes. This conspiracy theory, as you all know, not only culminated in an act of insurrection on January 6th in the Capitol, which has led to criminal charges filed against 1,265 people to date. But it also was taken up by domestic media. Fox News repackaged and regurgitated this, even though we now know through lawsuits, nobody in Fox News really believed this was true. They were just doing it as a kind of information operation on behalf of their preferred candidate. Well, this cost Fox News $787 million in civil damages, led to the firing of their star presenter, Tucker Carlson, himself a purveyor of not just pro-Trump conspiracy theories that are homegrown, but also pro-Russian disinformation and conspiracy theories on everything from the use of Syrian chemical weapons to the existence of Ukrainian biolabs. Remember that, Chestnut? Where does this leave us in 2024? Well, obviously, Russia is now preoccupied with something else of much more strategic interest to itself, which is the war in Ukraine. This has become now a war of attrition on a physical battlefield, but it is also a war of attrition at the information level. Moscow, as we know, has banked on Western exhaustion, a declining interest in Ukraine, translating into a diminution in security assistance. Frankly speaking, it didn't think the United States and Europe would be in the fight for this long. And while it's true that the U.S. electorate's attention has drifted elsewhere, the Israel-Hamas war, attendant cultural repercussions at home, the upcoming Biden-Trump rematch, the economy and immigration, and so on, Washington and Brussels have only increased aid to Ukraine. Moreover, they have escalated in the type of munitions they're providing Kyiv and in their lifting of restrictions on the use of those munitions inside Russian territory. This has led Russia to repurpose its online activity to try and muddy the waters with respect to support for Ukraine. So we've seen recent analyses in the last 2 months by both OpenAI and Facebook, now Meta, suggesting their efforts to sway public opinion are largely focused on lowering support for Ukraine, while also sprinkling in commentary on the US election and Gaza and so on. There's a 2-year-long operation known as Doppelganger, which has targeted all countries in Europe, including countries, excluding, I should say, in addition to countries in the global south, such as Venezuela. Their activity is quite profound, except that social media has learned a trick or two since 2016, and there are better mechanisms in place, you might even call them counterintelligence mechanism at a private corporate level, to knock down these artificially generated commentators, bots, whatever. And also, because there's been such a preponderance of information in the public about Russian concocted schemes, ordinary users are quite able to detect when it's not an authentic American or European speaking to them. In fact, one of the names of another operation is called bad grammar, because so many of these comments tend to be in what you might call a form of Runglish. Now, it is absolutely the case that we have seen in the last year alone MAGA-aligned U.S. politicians such as Marjorie Taylor Greene and Senator J.D. Vance trafficking in anti-Ukrainian falsehoods, falsehoods which are amplified by Russian intelligence fronts and Russian state media. However, a closer look at what they're talking about shows that these narratives too, much like as we saw in 2016, are actually originating from within the United States by far-right domestic actors. So I'll give you an example. Marjorie Taylor Greene recently linked to on Twitter to a fake news story by something called the Strategic Culture Foundation. This is a Russian intelligence front that has been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department. And the fake news in particular suggested Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, took U.S. aid and spent it on 2 yachts to the tune of about $80 million. Vance himself has echoed this general allegation about purloined U.S. aid money going into the pockets of corrupt Ukrainian ministers. But as Thomas Rid and Gavin Walsh have reported in Foreign Affairs magazine, the yacht story began inside the United States in far-right media ecosystems that predate the use of them by Russian state intelligence. So again, we are beginning to see now a replay of what we saw in 2016. Homegrown nonsense, identified and amplified by Russian special services, repurposed by Americans who already believe it, sometimes are swayed by it, or who may have even originated the nonsense themselves. So it's a kind of infinite regression of this stuff. We do Moscow a favor, I think, when we pretend that they are always the source or the provenance of our own psychosis. More regularly, how they act is as happy eggers on of it. The analogy I would use is if the American electorate is like lemmings running off a cliff, the Russians are standing at the precipice of the cliff with signs saying, keep going, you're doing great, right? They want us to commit suicide at the level of epistemology and the level of social cohesion. Now, this is where I see the main danger for 2024. And we have, just a few months now until a U.S. presidential election, and the first debate, I think, is tonight between Biden and Trump. I fully expect to see the GRU and the SVR try their usual shenanigans, attempting to hack into political campaigns, state infrastructure, muck about on social media, even though, as I mentioned, there are stronger antibodies that have been built up at the government and private sector levels. But in a sense, they can afford to be a little less successful this time around, and that owes, again, to very homegrown or domestic considerations. Social cohesion, I would argue, has frayed, perhaps irrevocably, in the United States in the past 8 years. And I don't pretend to be a sociologist on this issue, but to my mind, there are several factors at play here. Number one is the COVID pandemic, and now increased resentment about excessive measures that were taken to curb its spread, such as school closures, measures which, by the way, even policymakers acknowledge were excessive and counterproductive. Fauci came out and said we shouldn't have shut down schools. I know I'm here in Sweden where you guys are seen as sort of the bastion of sense and enlightenment on this thing. Another major factor or precipitant was the police murder of George Floyd and the rise of Black Lives Matter. Remember, what the troll farm identified as a then somewhat marginal social movement blew up into a national phenomenon with international repercussions. We saw BLM activists in London, in certain European countries, showing solidarity out of a sense of racial justice in the United States. This is now also facing a severe pushback due to perceived excesses in the racial justice program, including the adoption and now rescission of DEI policies in U.S. government and U.S. companies on universities or in universities. This is the focus of a very influential counter-movement spearheaded by conservative activists and politicians such as Ron DeSantis in Florida and some of the aforementioned MAGA cases who are very vocally anti-Ukraine. Another factor is October 7th. So not only did this take away attention from the war in Ukraine, Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's resulting war in Gaza has led to a spike in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. There was an attack on a synagogue, parishioners in a synagogue in Los Angeles just this week. It's also led to a rise in pro-Palestinian demonstrations across the country, including occupations, basically, student-led occupations on U.S. university campuses. This is perhaps the most polarizing discourse in America at the moment, and it's already lasted about 8 or 9 months, and it will continue for the foreseeable future, well into the 2024 election. And certain pundits and commentators suggest that it will have an impact, perhaps a decisive one, on determining the outcome of that election, given the demographics of Arab and Muslim communities, particularly in Michigan, another big swing state that Biden would have to win. I would argue that one of the biggest issues we faced, and sorry if I'm running too much time here, is the debate about disinformation and foreign interference itself has become so controversialized and radioactive in my country. I mean, we're sitting here in a forum sponsored by an agency that is meant to study foreign disinformation and interference. In the United States, you can't have a sane or sensible discussion about this anymore. Serious scholars of the subject are vilified as agents of some Orwellian thought police. They have seen their NGOs and their research facilities shut down due to litigation leveled against them by people that they say are purveyors of disinformation. And this is a problem that is kind of dialectical. So while the pro-Trump right might have its alternative facts, we are seeing now, even in media institutions, some of which I've worked for in the past, a kind of left-wing version of this, which suggests that moral clarity trumps the actual fact-based gathering of news. And people, veteran journalists at news organizations, are leaving their jobs and saying that, you know, complicated facts or nuances in stories that are in the public interest, whether about immigration, or war, or social issues, are being treated as anathema and therefore consigned to the dustbin within news gathering organizations. The right leans into this and says, you see, we told you, this is the culture war that we're fighting. We're also seeing weird bedfellowism in terms of denying that the Russians did absolutely anything in 2016. The far right and the far left are aligned on this issue. They believe that the FBI or the so-called deep state sought to sink a democratically elected president. They believe that any efforts at the federal or state level to combat disinformation and foreign meddling are, again, a form of censorship, an erosion of First Amendment rights. So basically, you have this emerging view, which has taken hold among quite a large swath of the population that, you know, there was no collusion, but also the GRU and the IRA did nothing, right? So it's either the Russians installed Donald Trump or they did absolutely nothing. There's no room for a gray area zone here. So I do need to wrap it up, yeah?
We need to wrap it up,
Okay.
but we will get back to this in the discussion with all of the panelists.
Okay. So I'll leave it there for now, and hopefully I can make a few more remarks
All right.
later on.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that very interesting presentation. I could continue listen to this. There's so much to dig into, and we will do so in the following discussion. First, we'll broaden the perspective a little bit by hearing from Jakub Kalenský about sort of how the situation in the US relates to the global context of malign information influence attempts. So, Jakub, please.
Thank you very much, Katarina. The question is very simple. How does this, what Michael was talking about in the US, fit into what we see happening on a broader scale? And I picked like two very short points. In each of them, what is the same and what is actually different? What is the same is this targeting of the weak spots of the society. During the previous panel, I was talking about this KGB metaphor of the drop of water falling on a stone. There is another KGB metaphor exactly on this mechanism, the so-called evil doctor. It is something that Ladislav Bittman talked about. Ladislav Bittman was the officer of the Czechoslovak version of the KGB, and he was responsible for active measures, especially those in the information domain. And he said that the work in the disinformation factory, usually the Soviet embassies abroad, consisted of a so-called evil doctor mechanism. You were trying to do the most precise diagnosis of your patient possible. What are his biggest weaknesses? What are his biggest illnesses? And you are trying to make these weaknesses worse, not better. You are trying to speed him to an early grave. This mechanism is everywhere the same. Russians will be doing this everywhere. What is different? The illnesses. Michael talked about the racial question being the #1 topic in the United States. This is not a topic that you could use in my home country, which is racially extremely homogeneous. For some reason, which also doesn't make much sense, migration works very well. Before the Ukrainian full-scale invasion, we accepted like 12 refugees per 10 million country. But for some reason, it is a very big topic for the disinformation outlets. In countries neighboring to us, Poland, Slovakia, it could be the LGBT question. It's very polarizing, especially in a more Catholic country. And it seems that the more south, the more east you go, the more this topic can be important. So these might be the differences, but the mechanism of weakening your opponent is everywhere the same. And it is this grand objective of Russian information operations or active measures in general? How can we weaken the adversary and thus, in a zero-sum game approach, strengthen us in Moscow? That's more on the strategic level. And if I go on the more tactical level or techniques and procedures, what is the same? The Russians will always get help from some local helpers. Always. They will inevitably find them. When they identify them, they are cultivating them, they are helping them. Sometimes they are funding them, sometimes they don't have to fund them. Sometimes they are spreading it for these, this MICE acronym, either for money, for ideology, for compromat, or for ego. So sometimes the people are just happy to appear on Russia Today, and they say whatever they should say to appear on TV. Especially since we in the West are doing a bit better job in identifying these operations. So roughly since the Mueller investigation and since the 2016 elections, Russians increasingly focus on this information laundering. How can we find more local actors who will be helping us to spread our disinformation, and it will actually look like something that is domestic, that is homegrown. What is different in this particular regard, not everywhere you would have the president being the main helper to Russian disinformation campaign. I actually come from a country where we also had presidents doing that, 2 of those. We had 20 years of pro-Kremlin presidents. They were doing a very good job. But it's not common. I mean, you don't have it here in the north of Europe. It wasn't very usual in the west of Europe. In some other countries, it could be the heads of state, heads of government, Hungary, Slovakia, but usually it will be far more marginal actors. I mean, I currently live in Finland. They are very happy that their main pro-Kremlin useful idiot, Johan Beckman, is so marginal that nobody really pays attention to him. These information laundering operations, however, despite the fact that somewhere they can be less successful, I think they're very dangerous because then they can hide the Russian blame. Then it looks like something that we are to blame for and not the Russians. It might divert the attention from who is to blame here. Obviously not for all the weaknesses the Russians are to blame, but they are to blame for abusing them. These are 2 different topics, but I fear that sometimes this gets merged into one debate. Because we have weaknesses, we can't blame Russia for abusing them. And I'm not a very big fan of this logic. To me, this is very resemblant of the pseudo-argument, the girl is to blame, she got raped, she was wrongly dressed, she went to the wrong place. No, we want to have audiences that might be vulnerable. We want to have audiences that will have difficult conversations about difficult topics. But to facilitate that, we have to prevent external influence. We have to prevent this amplification of these bad tendencies that will inevitably appear in any discussion. Let me stop here, and I will be happy to elaborate in the panel discussion.
Thank you, Jakub, for broadening that perspective. And finally, before we move on to the discussion, we'd like to hear from MPF's very own Andrea Liebman about, not the least, the technologies being used in various information influence attempts.
That's exactly right. I'm going to complicate things even more now. So just yesterday, I was thinking, I'm going to prepare for this. Well, I've been preparing. As I work for MPF, you prepare all the time. So I thought, look things up on Anthropic. It's an American company. Their Claude 3 Sonnet, new large language model. Let's see what comes up when it comes to the US elections. Anyone used it here? It's very new. It's just recently published. They have a few other ones. How about ChatGPT? You used it here? Show of hands? Okay, that's a bit more. All right. But this sort of shows a little bit that not everyone, but it will come. Pretty much everyone, I would say, in a few years from now, will be using these large language models and other AI services to inform yourself about stuff, analyze things, and so on and so forth. So I'm talking to a friend, colleague, and I was saying, I was looking this up, and Trump and Biden, nothing came up. And then he's like, interesting. Well, how about like alternative candidates? Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, nothing. So without sort of exploring that further, it's just interesting to see the power that these companies, that they have, and also the responsibility that they have for us, people, populations, and the way we receive information. If you changed your prompt, which is sort of like the question in this Claude model, it's brilliant, by the way, just tells you to change it, and it sort of guides you to change your question so that eventually you could get something on Biden and Trump. Still not Kennedy. And you can imagine if the Kennedy crew, and perhaps he's maybe not as controversially sort of big as perhaps Trump, but let's say Trump would not be able to be found on this large language model. You can imagine the explosion of anger. So there's a few things here to take into account just in preparing for an election like this. And I would say the thing is that people still don't really know about this yet. But it's going to come, and the companies, as the social media companies have had to do, they have also had now the responsibility to moderate content. And so these are LLMs I'm talking about, but we're still looking, as I said, it's the early stages. And when it comes to antagonistic use of it, the same. When it comes to these text models, what we see the trend so far is pictures, we see videos, and we see sound. That's what's there, and it's easy to produce, and that's what's coming. But also from private persons and from state actors, non-state actors. So the bar has lowered now. Everyone, it's accessible to everyone. So of course the threat picture changes. And it's been, and what I'd like to say further is that, which actually my boss Michael once said, an important factor for the effect of AI-generated information influence is the possibility of spreading it and reaching target groups. So that's the next level. And where with the help of generative AI, which is the images, sound, and video, it becomes faster, cheaper, and easier to reach out with these antagonistic messages. So the development of social media and other means of communication, such as gaming platforms, also need to be considered when action options are developed to deal with these future challenges, risks, and vulnerabilities. And ahead of the US elections now, just to quickly tie it to that before I wrap up, we've seen AI-produced videos attempting to appeal to right-wing voters with false messages, sort of like meddling with the ideas of these far-right groups. We've seen AI-made robocalls intimidating President Joe Biden, targeting voters in the primary. Urging them to vote, and we've seen not to vote, I'm sorry, it's a very important one actually, and we've seen videos circulating on social media purporting to tell the story of a troll farm in Kiev, targeting the US elections. And in these videos, a woman named Olesia, she speaks English with a Slavic accent, and she gives a first-person account of how she and her colleagues initially worked in support of Ukrainian President Kalenský. And then she says, after a visit by mysterious Americans who probably were the CIA, the group began sending messages to American audiences in support of President Biden. So there's this both sides, and the purpose of this type of creating these fake videos is, of course, to cloud the political debate ahead of the elections coming now. And in addition to these videos, US researchers and government officials, they say that Russia has created a handful of fake American local news sites. So we see this trend of creating websites that we've talked about in previous seminars, and using them to push Kremlin propaganda interspersed with stories about crime, politics, and culture. So sort of a wide array of issues. So to finish up now, due to the challenge of actually detecting AI content, which we talked about in previous seminars as well, and estimating its quantity and spread, it's quite hard to judge impact of of AI. And so far, we don't have that kind of yet. While AI certainly has the potential to revolutionize the world of disinformation, it has not done so yet. So AI is used to sort of certain tasks for now within the disinformation production and distribution cycles, such as information laundering, rewriting, translating, automation. That's where we are at the moment. And boosting the quality of disinformation, like deep fakes, which is particularly pertaining to AI, has so far proven to be less significant than boosting the quantity of AI-powered disinformation. But we do know that one piece of video or sound clip can actually, depending on the critical time, let's say, just before election day, it can change discourse. We've seen that as well. So discussion and analysis have focused way too much on the technological potential on AI, this is my assessment, and way too little on how human audiences react to it. So this is also something that we need to keep abreast of. And confusion, fear, and uncertainty of human audiences has already led to hard real-life actions, even in cases when AI was not even used. Now, this is called liar's dividend. So, and people are all also talking about like, oh, that's such as interest groups or private persons, or celebrities, politicians. They say, oh, well, that's produced by AI, but it actually has been stated that it's not. And so to reduce such psychological and social risks, AI literacy and cyber literacy in combo now are going to be essential. Thank you. Ska jag stanna här?
So please stay on the stage, and I would like to welcome up Michael and Jakub as well. Yes, and help yourself to some water. It's rather necessary on a day like this. Yeah. Oh. Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so I thought I'll sort of start off with Michael, but this is a discussion, so Andrea and Jakub, feel free to sort of wave your hand and dig in here also. You said something that to me is kind of depressing to hear, Michael, to be frank. You said that the US audience is rather sick and tired of hearing of this sort of whole disinformation debate has become politicized. But how on earth do you prepare then?
I mean, that's an excellent question, and I think the Russians are sort of counting on us not to be able to prepare for it. Let me give you a statistic. I wanted to round out my earlier remarks with this. And this is, I didn't even realize the extent of it until I looked it up. In 1973, let me give you the analysis of public faith in mass media. In 1973, around 70% of both Republicans and Democrats and about 60% of independents had trust in mass media. What they saw on television on CBS, what they read in the New York Times, Washington Post. As of 2023, 11% of Republicans, 58% of Democrats, and 29% of independents do. So they don't believe what they read in the newspaper or what they see in cable news or even network. And this suggests that they're relying on alternative streams of information or news. And what I would call this is meta news, because usually these alternative streams, bloggers, YouTubers, TikTokers, God help us, they're not reporting anything. They're just commenting on what the mainstream media is reporting. And more to the point, they're lambasting the mainstream media for its misreporting or its bias or its perceived distortions. You know, there's an old saying that, you know, he who believes in everything believes in nothing. But extreme skepticism has a way of grading into credulity. And if you believe in absolutely nothing, you can also be susceptible to believing in anything. And this is the real danger that we have. And like I say, you know, the Russians can wield a very light touch here. They don't have to come up with wholesale schemes or tropes. They just have to see what we're saying about ourselves or against ourselves and amplify and push. And I mean, for them, it's delightful to see, you know, something that they have simply regurgitated from the domestic sphere winding up being promoted or publicized by a mainstream political candidate. I mean, some of the stuff that the Internet Research Agency was doing in 2016 was actually getting real live Americans to attend rallies that Prigozhin's troll farm organized. And then some of these rallies, which were pro-Trump, Donald Trump, the candidate, tweeted on Twitter. So the Russians didn't, you know, brainwash these Americans. They were already pro-Trump, but they organized them. They coordinated their efforts.
So it's part of a continuation of the evil doctor diagnosis that we heard Jakub talking about earlier. But just a follow-up question to that: if there's no real debate about, or it's too inflammatory or whatever, to continue with the doctor speech here, but. Is there any debate or efforts on, for instance, media literacy, or you mentioned social cohesion towards in your talk as well?
Well,
Because these could be efforts to counter it without you necessarily having to talk about this looming threat from disinformation that seems to be so divisive.
So, I mean, in 2014, I did a paper with Peter Pomerantsev in which we advocated, we need counter disinformation portals. We should have public ombudsman on disinformation. And I have to say, I think we were overly optimistic and perhaps a little naive because all of these things are in place, right? Under Trump, the State Department created an agency called the Global Engagement Center. It is specific remit, just like MPF, is tracking foreign disinformation and propaganda. It has absolutely no authority to investigate what Americans are saying. To listen to both the MAGA right and the far left, including congressmen who are looking to defund GEC, this is something out of 1984. This is the Biden administration censorship organization to codify a consensus, a government-built consensus that will promote liberal Democrats at the expense of conservative Republicans. It's nonsense, and the GEC is fighting for its life. But this is how dangerous it is. You ask what can be done. I mean, look, some of the more encouraging efforts I've seen are happening in countries that are very culturally homogenous, and I don't mean that in any racial or ethnic way, but I mean they have a shared history. They have there's a common understanding of what their own national security threats are. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, countries that were either occupied by the Soviets or former Warsaw Pact nations. Finland does a very good job, I think, of teaching media literacy, media skepticism at a very young age. So if you're in kindergarten, you're taught, just because your friends are liking something ferociously on Facebook, doesn't mean you have to do it too. Interrogate the information first, right? I'd love to say that the United States is going to or is even capable of doing that. But the minute, you can imagine, I mean, the tableau I've painted for you is forbidding for a reason. You can imagine a debate in Congress or on cable news. Well, we need to get the children. I mean, people will lose their minds. They will think that this is an indoctrination program, not a public service or a public education program in a totally apolitical manner. So right now we're in a point where, facts themselves are seen as hostile actions, particularly by the right, but increasingly, as I was alluding to earlier, younger generations on the left are also very wary of reporting certain things that don't conform to a comforting progressive narrative. And a lot of veteran reporters, of which I can introduce you to many, are kind of aghast at this because that's not the business they got into. You tell the truth come what may. It's not about pushing a kind of narrative. So yeah, I'm very pessimistic about where my country is headed, at least at the social level. It depends. Political level, I mean, I don't know.
I want to look some more to the methods used here, and asking you also, Andrea and Jakub. We heard Michael in his introduction. You reminded us of what really happened in 2016, and thank you for that reminder, because it's easy to forget. But one of the things that strikes me is that many of the methods, I mean, AI has been developed since, but many of the methods are rather similar now. We just had a seminar here before where we talked about that we see an increased convergence of cyber attacks with the influence operations, whereas that was like one of the major things in the US 2016 elections. So I would like to ask all of you, the panel, on sort of what methods are you observing, and do you see any method of choice, any preferred methods from antagonist actors, both around the world and specifically targeting the US? I'll start with you, Jakub.
Okay. If I may, just 2 points to the previous question as well, like how to counter it if the debate is so polarized. And yes, there are those defensive measures we need to be focusing on, like building up resilience of our nation. It is important. However, let's also keep in mind that not everybody can become Finland or Sweden overnight. There are factors that are not exactly easily replicable, like the level of trust into the institutions, the very strong depoliticization of the civil service, which is something that in our region we dream of, but we don't have. These are also parts of the very strong trust of the population into the messaging of the mainstream media and of the institutions. I think part of the package also has to be about trying to stop the bad actors, stop the aggressors. They still have it far too easy. And I heard many people say, well, the Russians don't need to do much because we do most of the stuff ourselves, but we still haven't seen actually how it looks like if the Russians do not interfere. We don't have this control sample that could tell us actually what is the difference that they are making. So stopping them from causing damage, I think it would still go a very, very long way, especially in some of the audiences. And Michael, you mentioned that in some of the recommendations, maybe you were too optimistic because they are there. There's one recommendation that I keep repeating for almost a decade already, and that still hasn't been implemented, and that's this Transparency International for Disinformation. We still don't have it. A big, powerful NGO that would create a methodology from the central hub that would ask for comparable data from various countries so that we could say whether the problem is worse or better in Czech Republic or in Slovakia. We still don't have it. Such a big, strong NGO could also fill some of the gaps that some of the institutions, like actually MPF or Visionim, have to leave open. Many of the state agencies can focus only on the foreign influence. The NGO actor could actually monitor those domestic actors who are helping the foreign information operations to spread. So they could fill a very important gap that is still open nowadays. So I think that there is something more that we could still be doing. And about the methods, I mean, this is the aspect where I would actually agree with Michael. Most of the recommendations are already there. I think we are going in the right direction. We are just not going fast enough. We are not putting behind enough resources. So we are doing some documentation of what the Russians are doing, but we see only the tip of the iceberg. We maybe don't even see 5% of what they're doing. With China, we probably see even less. When it comes to raising awareness, we do have campaigns like my previous team, EU versus Disinfo, MPF is doing that, but we are not doing it on the scale that the Russians are doing it. Russians are still outspending us in this regard. They are still spending more money on this. And similarly, with most of the other countermeasures that we would see, Russians are putting into this thousands and thousands and thousands of people and billions of dollars. And we usually have a team of 20, 30, 40. These are the best resourced in Europe. Sometimes it's just 5 people. We are putting in millions against billions. The old Stalinist principle that quantity has a quality of its own, it is valid also in the information space.
We are used in Russia today also.
Yeah. So that's it.
Thank you, Andrea. When it comes to methods specifically,
yes.
what have you observed? I mean, AI is on everyone's lips right now.
Yeah. I can say when it comes to social media platforms, the companies have become better at detecting what used to be one of the methods was to develop these large bot networks. That's improved from the end of the social media companies. So now the threat actors have developed ways of becoming harder to identify. Cross-posting is something. You develop content, you use many different platforms, you use proxies even on the platforms. And now I would say a new trend that we can add on to it is the development of these sites, these websites. We see it on local level, Russia, China, in the US, for example, and elsewhere. I would say with AI, we just have to wait and see a little bit what will come. It's still too early. The actors are, I think, themselves learning about it, actually. And also perhaps the focus is, as Michael said also earlier, a bit elsewhere, but it will come. And we do monitor that as well. We want to know before things pick up speed. We want to know how these how AI services will be used. I would say one thing to keep an eye on are large language models that I mentioned, and the use of these models to then produce content for large bot networks and try to then create this specific sort of amplification that is also on local dialect levels. We've seen that. With the help of these services to produce really good language, and also quite targeted on vulnerable target groups, for example.
When it comes to now we talked about methods. When it comes to actors, Michael, again, you were kind enough to remind us of the actors that were involved in the 2016 presidential elections. Whereas today we see that also other actors are picking up the speed when it comes to influence operations. What main actors would you say are sort of possible threats, possible antagonists, besides, as you pointed out, U.S. domestic sort of the internal dimension of this? But if you look at foreign actors, which ones would you sort of point to keep an eye on ahead of the elections?
The new phenomenon that worries me the most, even outside of the information sphere, but just pure intelligence is this Russian remote recruitment and remote control of saboteurs. There are cases all over Europe, dozens of them. Some of them are now being litigated, in fact, where people living in the West are connecting with Russian intelligence organs via social media, Telegram, video games, multiplayer video games. They're being enlisted to conduct a kinetic military operation, set something on fire, blow something up, whether it's a shopping mall or a bus depot in Czechia, or a military facility, a warehouse for storing munitions destined for Ukraine, whatever. They pay them a few $1,000s on cryptocurrency, and then that's all she wrote, right? Whether these people are successful, it doesn't matter. This has already begun to sow a lot of panic and paranoia in Western electorates that the Russians are resorting to a kind of non-state actor methods using the vast resources of a state. Another word for this would be state terrorism. I mean, I wrote a book on ISIS. When ISIS's caliphate was crumbling and operatives could not come from Europe, get trained in Syria and Iraq, and then be dispatched into their native countries to do the Bataclan massacre, for instance, what did ISIS do? It did exactly this. It started connecting with people it had never met, sort of invisible armies of willing accomplices. Didn't have to pay them because ISIS is more an ideological factor. And then suddenly you started to see terrorist attacks, some of which were the most gruesome and devastating in the history of ISIS's existence. What worries me then is that if the Russians are doing this for military purposes or violent acts, they will also begin to do it for espionage purposes and for information purposes. So, for instance, now Yevgeny Prigozhin is dead, his troll farm is kind of defunct, but you don't need that anymore. You can connect with domestic actors, you can pay them. Some of them might even be aware that it's the Russian services or a foreign intelligence service doing it, they just don't care. Because again, we're in this sort of postmodern nihilistic period where truth doesn't matter and everybody in my own country is lying to me and whatever. That's, to me, what I would be on the lookout for the next trend. And whether it starts now before this presidential election, I really have no doubt it's going to take off in the near future. And it's going to be very hard to interdict because, again, these are people who live amongst us. You know, it takes a lot of work and effort to train up an intelligence operative and to give him training. And, you know, another point I would like to make is when you rely on amateurs, riffraff, not even organized crime. I mean, you know, there was a 64-year-old pensioner in Essex who was arrested as a Russian intelligence operative recruited remotely with a large dossier on an unnamed member of parliament. So assassination is going to be part of this. When you rely on amateurs, the potential for collateral damage is going to be great. And all the Russians would have to do is get something like this to happen in the United States and imagine the consequences immediately. The Russians deny that they were responsible. Loads of people could get killed, not because they were the target, but because some idiot put together a bomb or an explosive that blew up prematurely. Half the country would say, the Russians done it, we need to escalate with the Russians. The other half of the country would be like, no, it was the deep state, it was Hillary Clinton in a pizza parlor. You know, the act alone, whether it is technically, tactically successful, will be strategically quite effective because it will amplify this or contribute to this divisiveness and this erosion of social cohesion that I was alluding to earlier.
So acts by proxies,
yep.
Something to look out for. I would like to open up the floor for you, the audience, to pose questions and comments. And I see that we have a first question here. Please introduce yourself so that our viewers can know who you are as well.
Thank you very much for the panel discussion. So my name is Frederick, and I'm curious, Michael, a question for you. I've been sort of looking into the woke movement, the whole BLM thing, and the cancellation culture coming from the humanities departments at the university in the States since like 8 years or so. And what amazes me that it seems to have been creeping in through the HR departments into the corporate structure of America. So we have a lot of corporations who are really political. And my question is, since you're in the context of America, I don't really understand how the capitalist system can allow corporations, or very large corporations like Disney and even larger corporations, to actually take a side on the political stance. That sort of halves your audience directly and your consumers, right? How does that work? Why isn't it sort of cancelled, and what's the connection to outside influence?
My wife is an HR executive at a company. I'm sure she would kill me if I told you. But I can tell you that this conversation, this debate is happening across the board in the United States right now. And, you know, it's leading to a reversal of policies, right? To me, it's sort of dialectical. The right says cancel culture. The left says, no, there's no such thing, it's accountability. What's happened, I think, recently is October 7th has brought all of this sort of simmering resentment and grievances and sort of ideological debate. It came gushing to the surface. Suddenly now people are saying BLM leads to not pro-Palestinian demonstrations, but pro-Hamas demonstrations. So this is all being kind of litigated in a very toxic environment. I don't have any answers on this. I'm not interested in the culture war in itself. I'm interested in how the culture war contributes to basically what we're discussing here. But as I say, you know, if you're sitting in the headquarters of a foreign intelligence service, you kind of go, you know, I mean, because the left is accused of hiding or not talking about things that are very much apparent and happening. The crisis at the southern border, for instance, with illegal immigration and asylum seekers and so on. The right is accused of weaponizing these things for its own electoral purposes. And both things can be true at the same time, but good luck getting to some consensus there, right? You know, I mean, the sort of happy middle ground increasingly does not exist. Now, I mean, the good news, I know I'm a doom and gloomer here. The good news, I would say, is this. We live in a kind of distorted prism of what reality is these days because so much of our existence is lived online. And, you know, when you see social media engagements and people with millions of followers on Twitter and therefore seemingly outsized levels of influence, you're very afraid to try and rebut or engage them critically. And you think that these are the people who actually control the United States electorate. But they don't. And a lot of people don't spend their lives online, and they vote in ways that are kind of unpredictable and unpredicted. I mean, this arguably is how Donald Trump became president, against all expectation. So there is a way of, you know, trying to figure out what is happening in physical reality in my country. But, you know, look, I'm a journalist by trade. My industry is being hollowed out, both for financial reasons, for this lack of public trust that I've described, for the proliferation of digital technology, which is superseding mainstream media. One of the big problems we have in our country is we don't have local reporting anymore. You know, so if you want to find out what somebody in a swing state is saying, you're going to find it out through national media, which doesn't have the resources to actually drill down into who these people are, what are their concerns and complaints. I mean, look, Donald Trump very skillfully, I'm not his supporter, as you may have guessed, but his political insight was that for too long, the elites or the establishment have been lying to you and conning you and exploiting you. And I have to tell you, I mean, I lived until recently in a purplish area of New York where people who would lay down in traffic to protect myself and my family are not only pro-Trump, absolutely buy into this notion that people like myself are corrupt, even though I'm their friend, right? But then also think that, you know, we never landed on the moon, that Zelensky has more than 2 yachts, all paid for with taxpayer money. And yet, these are the people in your neighborhood, as we say, right? And yet, we're not having a conversation with them and really understanding like what motivates them to go into this direction. It's again, intense skepticism, if not an outright contempt for official information, which leads them to be very gullible and to buy into all manner of crazy conspiracy theories. And you know, again, I don't have a remedy because every time I try to come up with something like Transparency International, you mentioned we need an NGO. The first thing that popped into my mind is, oh God, what if George Soros finances it? Because that'll be the end in the United States. You know, it's like there's always a counter response to our attempts to correct it. Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know. Maybe I've just lived in America for too long and I am exhausted and demoralized. That's why I come to Europe and I come to countries like this. I mean, you do seem to have a better level of social cohesion and a kind of at least you disagree violently on things for sure. But when it comes to a baseline of factuality, it may be not great or maybe not completely ideal, but it's so much better than it is in the United States. I mean, the United States is sort of a continent, not really a country anymore. And, you know, I can travel to a European city or a European island like this, and I will have more in common with people here than I do with people who are maybe 30 minutes down the road from where I live in New York. So that's, to me, again, I think the call is coming from inside the house. I know we're talking about foreign actors, but really, unless we get our own country or our own society in order, foreign actors don't have to do very much to have such a deleterious effect, you know?
And during, well, these days here in Almedalen, here at MPF, we have talked a lot about sort of countermeasures and what we can do, and what everyone has stressed is sort of their own societies, that it begins here, and then there are various ways of fighting back and so forth. And for this, I really encourage you to, maybe this fall, I'm not sure when, but these seminars will be up and available online. So if you have not been here seeing all the seminars, it's not only shame on you, but you will have an opportunity to do so online very soon. With this, I would like to thank all our panelists for coming here and for participating and sharing their insights. But only one of them gets a gift, and it's Michael, who has traveled from far enough. So thank you, Michael, and thanks to you to all of the panel.